Hello, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for this presentation on the man who would be king, or should I say, the tale of a Pennsylvania Mason, who probably was, in my personal opinion, and some others, the precursor for the Rudyard or Brother Rudyard Kipling story, and later on that became a movie, The Man Who Would Be King. First and foremost, please excuse any hoarseness in my voice at this time, and if I have to go on mute, please understand that it'll be just for a short while, and I'll come back. So, just to begin with this presentation, many of us probably have had the pleasure of watching the iconic movie that was produced in 1975 and adopted to the big screen by John M. Huston. And it came out in 1975, and it starred with a stellar cast at the time. We had Sean Connery, Michael Caine, Saeed Jaffrey, and Christopher Plummer playing the role of Rudyard Kipling. Um, the movie is filled with Masonic symbols, from the chain around Sean Connery's neck to the symbol on the temple of the tribe that was found by Sean Connery and Michael Caine, someone towards like the first quarter of the movie. And there's a movie that I'm not gonna display, or a section of the movie, but I will describe, whereby Michael Caine steals a pocket watch from Rudyard Kipling and realizes that it had a Masonic symbol on it, feels guilty, and runs back towards the train and jumps into the same cabin with Rudyard Kipling and tries to slide the pocket watch back into him without him noticing. And a conversation ensues between Michael Caine in this movie and Christopher Plummer, who's playing Rudyard Kipling. It starts with a request. Michael Caine requests a favor of Christopher Plummer, to which Christopher Plummer declines kindly. And then he proceeds to tell him, "What if I told you that I'm a traveling man heading from the east towards the west, searching for that which was lost?" And that's when there is a mode of or moment of recognition of both their affiliation in the Masonic fraternity. That's what the movie is hinting for. So interesting, again, movie filled with many, many Masonic symbols. So to begin with, just to go back to the story itself and the author himself, Brother Rudyard Kipling was born in 1865 and passed away in 1936, transitioned to the Eternal East in 1936. Um, a little bit about him. He was made a Mason at the age of 20 in Lahore, India in 1866. His lodge's name was Perseverance Lodge number 782 in Lahore, Punjab, which is now modern day Pakistan, and was immediately made the lodge secretary. As soon as he joined at the age of 20, they made him the lodge secretary. In 1889, that's 3 years later, something happened, which we don't know exactly what, but seems like he resigned from all his Masonic craft lodges 3 years after he joined. That was the same year he published The Man Who Would Be King. Could it have been in direct relation to this publication? Could it have been because he used Masonic symbology in this story? Could it have been because the story was common folklore among Masons at some point and caused him some grief with other members? Nobody knows. But the facts are, the same year he published The Man Who Would Be King, 3 years after joining Freemasonry, our brother resigns from all his Masonic craft affiliation. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1907, and records suggest that he resumed his Masonic and fraternal activities in 1909. So almost 20 years after he resigned. He joined the Quator Coronary Correspondence Circle in 1918, immediately after his son's death in the Great War. So a lot of timeline that covers some of his Masonic affiliation and more to come. What's very interesting is the statement that he always quoted in some of his publications and verbally, where he says about his Masonic experience in 1886 through 1889 that he was entered by a member of the Brahmo Samaj, a Hindu, passed by a Mohammedan, a Muslim, and raised by an Englishman, a Christian. Our Tyler was an Indian Jew. So it is a direct correlation where Brother Kipling is trying to show the universality and the diversity, the religious and belief diversity within the fraternity of the Freemasons at the time of his entry into Perseverance Lodge number 782. Interestingly enough, a brother Master Mason in the United States in 1931 wrote to Brother Kipling asking him about his Masonic affiliation. Not sure if this brother was trying to write an article about Brother Kipling or have a large program about him, but we have the response that was sent back to this worshipful master by Brother Rudyard Kipling himself. And as you see in this letter, dated July 6, 1931, Brother Kipling responds to the worshipful master saying, "Many thanks for yours of the 25th day, which I ought to have acknowledged before." He's acknowledging that the letter that was sent on the 23rd, I'm sorry, of May, he should have acknowledged before, and he's apologizing for his delayed response. I am afraid I do not know any place where there is an account of my Masonic associations, but some time ago, I think it was in the United States, there was a series of articles about Masonic references in my writings. I do not recall the paper or the magazine in which they appeared. My mother lodge was He and Perseverance, 782 in Lahore, India, Punjab. I was entered by a Hindu, raised by a Mohammedan, and passed by an English master, but never rose beyond the office of a secretary. I am sorry I cannot help you more. Yours respectfully and fraternally, Rudyard Kipling. And here, I mean, this is a closer image of the letter itself. And as you see, again, he makes a reference to this diversity and universality of the nomenclature or clature of Freemasonry within our Brothers Lodge and Freemasonry surrounding him. The first appearance, actually, of this story, The Man Who Would Be King, wasn't when it was published in 1889. Before that, he published it in a series of three different stories, uh, and it was titled The Phantom, Rickshaw, and Other Eerie Tales in 1888. But it was such a hit that he decided to take it out of the three tales, and dedicate it as its own book in 1889, a year later. So that is to the left, you can see the cover of the Phantom Rickshaw Tales, the Eerie Tales by Rudyard Kipling, which included The Man Who Would Be King. And to the right, a copy of, or the front copy of his first print of this book. And being filled with Masonic symbology, it's fitting that the first sentence in his book has some Masonic reference to it. And the book starts with this sentence: "Brother to a prince and fellow to a beggar, if he be found worthy." So again, brother to a prince and fellow to a beggar, if he be found worthy. And I believe the movie itself starts also with this phrase, that exact phrase. Now, the plot takes place in a country at the time known as Kafirstan, and many in the 30s and even later, 1930s on, disputed the existence of such a nation or such a land. It became unknown at some point, and people thought it was a mystery or a mythical invention of Rudyard Kipling's imagination. In reality, Kafiristan did exist up till 1881. And the map we look at is from our State Department and dates back to 1927, April 28th, 1927. And it shows the lands where Kafiristan used to be acknowledged as not necessarily a sovereign nation, but as the name of certain provinces which constitute today modern day Afghanistan. And why is it important to delve into this story and to delve into the mind of Rudyard Kipling? Because he tells us that if history were taught in the form of stories, it would never be forgotten. So obviously, he wanted to teach us or to portray a moral lesson, let alone a story of a period of time, and most likely individuals that he wanted to imprint in the minds of his readers for generations to come, and rightly so. The story comes out in 1889. Almost 100 years later, in 1975, it translates into a hit movie starred by premier cast. So many have alluded to the fact that there could have been characters before 1889 that might have inspired Rudyard Kipling in his story and in his pursuit of this plot. That it wasn't completely imagined, that there was maybe some one or two or even more individuals who took that path and most likely were the inspiration behind the book. The first of them is the gentleman to the left bottom corner, uh, Gardner, or known among the locals at the time as Gardner Khan. Gardner Khan, or James Gardner, was a native of Wisconsin in the United States in the early 1800s, who traveled as a mercenary and enlisted in his services to the Russian Empire at around 1817 to 1821. Well, at one point, his employers decided to let him go. So he decided to seek employment elsewhere and became very more famous in the land of Kafiristan and modern day today Afghanistan as a someone you can hire, a hired gun basically. So this gentleman this became basically known as a warlord, someone you can hire to assist in developing your troops, training your troops, and even leading your troops. And Gardner was a US citizen that traveled to that part of the world at the time, seeking employment for his services and military services. The other person, all the way down to the right hand corner, bottom of the right hand corner, is an Englishman known as James Brooks. And James Brooke was well known for his adventures in Brunei and was made the first known white Khan. They called him the White Khan, referring to his European heritage and being made a governor over a province in Brunei. Not much more about him. He was involved in a couple of battles and died relatively young, but he was thought to be also an inspiration for this story. A third person to our right upper hand corner now is a German, Mr. Schwarzbreit, who um, was known as a botanist and had, with his brother, written a number of books about Bavarian nature and botany. And at some point after he published that book, decided to travel to the Far East, landed in China, and then traveled to Kafiristan, where the natives in Kafiristan thought he was a Chinese spy and executed him in the narrow strips of the mountains of Kafiristan, thinking again that he was spying on them and a land of turmoil, and that he was spying for the Chinese. To the very left upper side corner, we see a gentleman by the last name Watson. Watson was an English surveyor who, as you see him in the middle of the picture, the middle person sitting on a stool in this picture, traveled through Kafiristan and parts of India as a medical doctor, as a local medicine man, and surveyed the lands. And his work was very much acknowledged by the British Archaeological Society at the time, and he won several prizes for it and acknowledgments for it. However, there is no documentation of his involvement in any military action other than surveying on behalf of the British company at the time. Which leads us to our final character, the focus point of this presentation, the man in the middle. And this man is known as Josiah the Great or Josiah Harlan. And Josiah was a Mason. He was a native of Pennsylvania. He was born actually in Chester County, a Quaker by birth, and we'll learn more about him. Now, how did we come to Josiah the Great? Well, thanks to Ben McIntyre, a best-selling author, British author, who was covering in 2003 the war in Afghanistan, came across this story from the locals about this man who lived in Afghanistan and had some adventures and triumphs by working for some of the local emirs and tribesmen of the time, and became very well known and uh, had some legacy. And Ben McIntyre wrote this book about Josiah and his history and his story. A very interesting book that you can get through Amazon and read more about Josiah the Great or Josiah Harlan. So, who is Josiah Harlan? As I said, he was born in Newland Township in Chester County on June 12, 1799, to a pious Quaker family. Major event that impacted his life early on was the loss of his mother at the age of 13. He decided from that point, or maybe not decided, but from that point on, he dedicated himself to develop his linguistic abilities in Latin, in Greek, in French. And we'll understand later why that came handy. He started reading medical books, biographies, and history. And some references tell us that he was fascinated, absolutely fascinated with Alexander the Great. And some of you that know Alexander the Great and know his adventures and expansion to Afghanistan and India at one point in history would know where this interest of traveling to those portions of the world may have developed in Josiah Harlan. He stood at 6 feet tall and was described as a muscular, handsome man. That's according to Ben McIntyre in 2002. Now, Harlan had an older brother, Richard, and Richard was a surgeon, was a physician. And Richard was around 1819, 1820, returning back from India. And he comes back home and he tells his younger brother about the his fascination with India and with traveling and how wonderful it is, and that he would love for him to go and visit these parts of the world. The only problem is that Josiah at the time was engaged. He was engaged to be married. So somehow he managed to convince the love of his life to allow him to go on this journey for a short period, less than a year, and that he would return and marry her and live happily forever. And Richard, the physician, was able to manage to get Josiah not only a job on a one of the vessels traveling east, but also aided him with information as to where to go and what ports to visit. And Josiah sets sail and he leaves on this lifetime journey, hoping to return back for his love so he can marry her. Somewhere around during his trip, he receives information that the lady that he was engaged with too decided to get married to someone else, and as a matter of fact, gets married to someone else, and he's heartbroken and devastated. He turns around, comes back quickly back to Philadelphia, and realizes that nothing is to be done. It's over. She's married, and he cannot do anything about it. So what does he do? He decides, you know what? I interrupted my uh, trip. I'm gonna go back and get as far away from here as I can. And he travels for the second time now back to the Far East and gets to India with no job, not enough money, and decides to start looking for some way to maintain to generate sustenance. So he sees there were ads asking from the British East India Company looking for medical professionals and surgeons. Now, remember, it was Richard who was a physician, not Josiah. Josiah merely read some books when he was 13 years old and on, and self educated himself about some medical topics, but he was never professionally licensed or got a medical degree. Well, at that time in history, he did convince them to give him the job, and he was hired as a doctor, a medical doctor, and by the British East India Company. And for a period of almost 5 years between 1821 and 1826, he spent them as a surgeon and physician working for the British East India Company, uh, treating the troops and treating anyone else that works for the company. And wherever they want him to go, they send him over. Well, at one point in 1826, he was exposed to the Burma massacre. And it was probably a tipping point for him where he decided, I've had enough. 4 or 5 years of this, I need to do something different. And it seems that at the same time, he had read the account of the kingdom of Kabul and its dependencies in Persia, Tartary, and India, written by Mountstuart Elphinstone at the time, and developed interest in the kingdom of Kabul and those provinces. So he learns of a deposed prince, Shah Shuja. And this Shah Shuja was a brutal ruler, but he was deposed by one of his cousins or relatives. And the British took him in. At the time, Britain was occupying India, but didn't have much uh, or any presence in Afghanistan, in the lands of Kafiristan at the time. So they took Shah Shuja, the British took Shah Shuja under their wing, and they were prepping him in case one day they needed him or they needed to go and invade Afghanistan, then they would have an ally ruler they can put on the chair. So Harlan endears himself to Shah Shuja and he convinces him that I am your man. I'm the person who is going to restore you to your throne, but you need to give me what I need from men and guns and money for me to succeed. And before I do anything, I would like to go on an expedition travel to explore the situations in Kabul and surrounding provinces so I can put a plan together. Shah Shuja, this very mean, brutal ruler, believes Harlan and invests in the plan. And Harlan sets on his journey, traveling with a few uh, loyal subjects of Shah Shuja, guides, if you want to call them, and they travel as fakir dervishes, which are like roaming poor religious men who just roam from village to village, offer healing, spiritual healing to the locals for a meal or a fee, but traveling humbly and traveling with no means so they can stay under the radar and nobody suspects that they are spies. And they have to go through a tough road to get to Kabul. I mean, it's not only the terrain is tough, but also it's dangerous. Excuse me. So when they arrived to Kabul, they found that the ruler, Dost Muhammad Khan, the emir of Afghanistan at the time, is very well liked by the locals. He was beloved. They liked him. They didn't like the deposed ruler, Shah Shuja, because the other one was mean and brutal. But this emir was kind, very well respected, and the locals were very loyal to him. So Harlan writes back to Shah Shuja saying, I don't think this is going to work. This is not a good time. The environment, the culture is not on your side. We would easily be defeated if we proceed with a coup, and advises that they don't proceed with it. But Harlan is very smart, and he have seen the brutality of Shah Shuja with his servants and his subjects. So he decides not to go back because he knew that if he went back, Shah Shuja would show him no mercy. Instead, he decides to go to an enemy of Shah Shuja and Dost, the Maharaja Ranjit Singh, who was very well known throughout history and very influential. So Harlan walks into the court of the Maharaja Ranjit Singh in Punjab, and the Maharaja takes a liking to Harlan and endorses him. Not alone that, he appoints him as a governor on one of the provinces. And for the next 5 to 6 years, you have Josiah Harlan governing that province and living the life, living a very wealthy, posh life, collecting taxes for the Maharaja, governing and keeping order. And he takes on a puppy, a dog. And at some point, this dog dies, and Josiah Harlan becomes very saddened by it and starts rethinking life and his adventure or his goals in life. So he decides to quit the Pashi life. He decides to give it all away. All the riches that were under him, he gives it all away and decides to leave the Maharaja Ranjit Singh and to pursue adventures in the land, back in the land of Kafiristan. So he goes back at that point to Kabul, back to Muhammad Dost, the kind ruler I was talking about a few minutes ago, and appeals to him and becomes one of his generals. So, no doubt by now, between the British Indian Company, Shah Shuja, the Maharaja, and Muhammad Dost, there's no doubt that Josiah Harlan has a very convincing personality. He is able to sell himself well to all these people. Muhammad Dost appoints Josiah Harlan as a general, as one of his generals, and tasks him to train the troops. At one point, Muhammad Dost comes to Josiah Harlan and says, You know, on our northern border, there's this Uzbeki leader who keeps on raiding our villages on the northern border and really terrorizing the people there and kidnapping their young and stealing their monies, and it's causing tremendous unrest on the northern border of Kafiristan or modern day Afghanistan, and I need you to take care of it. Josiah Harlan looks at this as the opportunity of a lifetime, and he says, absolutely, I am the man for it. Takes 10,000 troops, 21 cannons, and orders the construction of an American banner. Imagine Now we're talking around 1838 in history, over 170 years ago, almost, or 100, yeah, almost 200 years ago. And you have this single American man living in Afghanistan, leading an army of 10,000 locals, and he orders an American banner to be constructed. And he marches with the troops with the American banner flying in the air and reaches the mountains and holds a launching ceremony. And from there, attacks province by province the Uzbeki leader and becomes able to sustain peace and to triumph in that area. One of the provinces which he frees and helps is the province of Gore in northern Kashmir, as you see in this map. And in Hamza, its capital, is where the prince of Gore relinquishes his title and makes Josiah Harlan the prince instead. So now Josiah Harlan becomes the prince of Gore and has this honorary title. So it's great. It's beautiful. Everything is going great. He achieved his objectives, and he was able to triumph, and he's able to bring glory back to Muhammad Dost. And right by the time where he comes back in 1839, back to Kabul to celebrate this triumph, the British invade. It was around that time in 1839 that the British invade Afghanistan and invade Kabul and remove Muhammad Dost. And all that Josiah Harlan has worked for pretty much goes to waste. Um, so just to draw a little bit of comparison here between what the story in the book says and the real story of Josiah Harlan tells us. Here's a man who's seeking adventure, who leaves glory, leaves comfort, to go further in a westerly direction towards Kabul, seeking adventure and a life of excitement, really, not a life of comfort, and seeks riches that way. He doesn't want riches that are given easily. He wanted riches that are earned the hard way. And voila, he achieves it, but then at the end, everything collapses in a blink of an eye. Well, if you've seen the movie, The Man Who Would Be King, you know of Daniel Dravit, who is Sean Connery, played by Sean Connery, and his companion, who's played by Michael Caine, both British soldiers, not exactly very honorable or do things right, who get dismissed from the military and decide to, you know what, we want to leave a life of comfort. We want to go into a life of adventure and travel towards Kafiristan or Afghanistan and land among a tribe in the mountains who decides, once noticing that they carry the same symbols of Alexander the Great that are Masonic in nature, to make Daniel Dravit, Sean Connery, the prince over them. So the comparisons in the story are tremendous, whereby similarly, Josiah Harlan, being able to free the natives of Gore, was made a prince over that province too. Very interesting comparisons, and why many think that really it is the story of Josiah Harlan was the precursor behind the book by Rudyard Kipling, by our brother Rudyard Kipling. But where's the connection? Well, you must know by now. Josiah Harlan must have been a Mason, and yes, he was, and we'll get to that in a minute. Um, so shortly after, um, the British become suspicious of this American man who's living still in Kabul, who had ties to Muhammad Dost, the previous ruler. And after a while, it seems like they got fed up of being patient and keeping him around. and they order him to leave on the spot. So he starts a journey from Kafiristan all the way back to the United States. But he goes through Persia, then Egypt, then Russia, then Italy. From Italy, he comes to England, and finally, he arrives in Philadelphia in 1841. So it took him a while. It took him almost 2 years to get back to the United States from the time he left Afghanistan in 1839 by the order of the British. He gets to Philadelphia in 1841 and he starts working on his first book, a memoir of India and Afghanistan. And he gets the book published, but the book was pretty much harsh on the British and used a lot of foul and bad language against the British. And a lot of the people in at the time were offended by it and didn't feel like it was a good literary book or wanted to engage with Harlan, which prevented him from publishing his second book, Oriental Sketches, as we'll see later. So this was the first book, and just to give you a little bit of background, all these documents I was able to go and see and inspect personally at the Chester County Historical Society. I learned through the book, or Ben McIntyre's book, that there are some of Josiah Harlan's belongings left at the Chester County Historical Society. And I decided to go there and see them for myself. And surely enough, I got an appointment. It was still like around 2 years ago when COVID was ramping. And I was allowed to come in. They were open for like 2 hours or 3 hours a day. And they had the file prepared. And I started delving through these books. And I got the original in my hand, the original writings, his handwritings of this first book, A Memoir of India. And when you realize that you're holding something that is the original and it's from a brother Mason, you can't help but feel their presence with you at that moment. You feel that connection in time, you feel that connection in history, without judging what they've done, their actions, or their motives. It's a different period of time and it's a different uh, culture altogether at the time. But to be in the presence of something written by someone in 1841, 1842, a brother, someone I would call a brother, that lived 6 miles away from where I live. I live in Chester County. He lived in Chester County. He was born in Chester County, and here I'm holding this book. You can only imagine how impactful that was. So looked through his document and found some interesting documents. One of them was a letter written by a friend of Harlan who seems to have like connections with the Persian authorities, asking them on March 3rd, 1840, to allow him passage and to grant him like a safe passage through um, the lands of Persia. I also was able to find a copy of his passport with the different stamps and passages allowing him to pass from one country to the other, the different countries that I explained, from Russia to England to Italy. And although these first two pictures here are not do not pertain to Harlan, through the help of the Masonic Museum and Library, I was able to find another brother's passport. It had the outside cover and it had like the original document that outlined who the person, the holder of the passport, was. And this was for a brother from the 1800s also. But unfortunately, Josiah Harlan's didn't have the cover. And I wanted to show you a sample in case you've never seen it before. But here we have Josiah Harlan's exact document, passport documents. So this is the proof of him being in Napoli on September 26, 1840. So as we track his journey back to the United States, this is a living proof from his passport that shows us that on September 26, 1840, he had a stamp at the American consulate in Napoli, Italy. And this is another one that shows us that he was on June 23rd, 1841, in London, in England. And this is the stamp that was provided to him at the United States consulate, allowing him to come back home. And on it, we see his handwritten signature, Josiah Harlan. Amazing when you see that live for the first time and you're connecting with this brother. Not only I found a copy of his original book, I found a handwritten copy of the book that was never published, Oriental Sketches. And as you see, this is the front page that denotes every chapter that he was intending to write. Like it seems like he wrote the chapters first and was then gonna delve into writing that, like he wrote the titles of the chapters that he intended to write the book about, and then he was gonna delve into writing these different chapters pursuing. So what about his Masonic records and his Masonic affiliation? Where again, thanks to the Masonic Museum and Library and Brother Lee Martin, who's with us today, we were able to find some of his records. We know that he was a member of Union Lodge number 121 in Philadelphia, PA. And we see that he was um, entered in October 1821. And let me give you the exact dates, actually. So he received the EA degree on October 1821, and we have the minutes, the stated meeting minutes. If you ever think why the minutes are important, this is a great example. We wouldn't have been able to verify his Masonic affiliation if we didn't have a good secretary at the time writing great minutes. So we know from these minutes that he was entered on October 1821. And as you see here, right here, it says Josiah Harlan entered, and it talks about him. Josiah Harlan, being in waiting, was introduced and received the entered apprentice degree. The brother returned thanks and received the benefit of a lecture from the worshipful master. Next, we know that on December 20th, 1821, he received the fellowcraft degree. And again, an entry in the book of the minutes shows that a fellowcraft uh, was opened in due form, and Brother Harlan, being in waiting, was introduced duly and received this fellowcraft degree. And finally, in January 17, 1822, we see that he received his Master Mason degree. And again, it's entered in the minutes by our brother secretary at the time. Uh, 5 years later, apparently, 5 years later, we also look in the minutes and find out that he was suspended for non-payment of dues. And it says basically, again, he left the United States after he got his degree. So sometime in 1822, that's when he left the United States and went to India. And he didn't come back till 1842. So it is no surprise that he was NPD. For the next 40 years, he didn't pay dues. But I believe, as I read, at the time, you had to be NPD for 5 years before you can be suspended from the craft. And that's why between 1822 and the wait till 1827 that he was suspended and his affiliation was terminated in a sense. I was in conversation with Brother Lee, who's with us today, and to this point, we have not been able to find any proof of his becoming affiliated again with the Masonic fraternity. But who knows? Maybe one day we can find a different lodge somewhere else. Maybe not in Pennsylvania, could be in Kentucky or in California, because we know he purchased land in Kentucky at one point and left it for his only one daughter, which I'll explain about in a minute. And we know that he passed away in California at a later date, but there's no proof in Pennsylvania so far that we were able to find about his reinstatement or coming back to the craft. So he comes back in 1841. He writes a book in 1842. He could not get published in 1843 for his second book. And he starts getting engaged in the community again. He gets remarried, and I believe he has one daughter that was born to him. almost 10 years later after he returns from Philly. And then at the brink of the Civil War, he decides to join the Union Army. And he joins the Harlan's Light Cavalry, which became later on the 11th PA Cavalry. And what we know about that period is Colonel Harlan was a very strict and harsh commander, to a point where the troops under him and the officers under him revolted and reported him to the general. He ended up being court-martialed and dismissed. And you have to remember that most of his past experience, at least military-wise, was with tribesmen. He was never over a regular army. He never commanded a regular army. He always commanded tribesmen, people that were irregular, that he tried to control and to make into an army. And probably that's what he was trying with these troops. He was trying to command them as with a harsh or firm hand, and that led them to revolt and got him kicked out, court-martialed, but didn't was not necessarily found guilty, but he was let go. He did not serve in the Civil War under the Union Army. So a tribute to Sean Connery again, whose movie was very inspiring. I saw this movie for the first time. I was 13 years old, and I cannot let you know how fascinated I was, not only with the story of the plot itself, but also with the symbology that is embedded in it. I come from a family of Masons, so it was very familiar to me to see these symbols and to engage in a conversation about all this with my grandfather, my mentor at the time. Um, and really, I see that movie as a defining moment for this early young man at 13 of age to be attracted to Freemasonry and attracted to pursue this fraternity. I want to give special thanks to Brother Michael McKee, the executive director of the Masonic Library and Museum of Pennsylvania, and to brothers Michael Comfort and Lee Martin, who without their help, I wouldn't have any of this constructed and put together. I wouldn't have had half or more than half of the images that you've seen today and the references that I made today. I'm indebted to them. That's a tribute to our Grand Lodge to have brethren that work tirelessly to preserve our heritage and to make sure that we have the tools that we need in order to research and grow through that research. Brother Lee, thank you so much. I would like to thank everyone for being here with us today. Please feel free at any time to reach out to us, to Brother Lee, myself. But thank you so much for being here.